Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Nonprofit Quarterly Advancing Practice session. My name is Jean Bell, and in collaboration with the Nonprofit Quarterly team, I direct Advancing Practice there. I'll explain a little bit about what that means in a moment. First, what I'd like to do is thank our sponsor, Fundraise. Fundraise wants to help you make impact, not spreadsheets. Their all-in-one platform was made for fundraisers by fundraisers. Spend less time on the boring work and more time on your cause. You can find out how to raise the funds and the fun at fundraise.io, funraise.io. You'll also see on that bottom left, there's a hashtag for today's conversation. If you're on Twitter, developing leadership. We're all on Twitter as well, those of you bringing this session. So you can find the quarterly at Nonprofit Quarterly. You can find our guest faculty from CRE at CRE in New York City. And I'm also on there at Jean Bell NP. Next slide, please. Let me review how we're going to go about this session today. I'll very briefly share just a little bit about our intentions with this Advancing Practice program at Nonprofit Quarterly. And then as your moderator, I'll provide a little bit of framing for today's session and then introduce the guest faculty. And then they'll take us through a three-part content section around defining terms, case examples, and considerations for implementation. And then I'll moderate Q&A with the speakers and then close with some next steps. A note that there are 4 polls throughout this session, as well as a Q&A session at the end and a survey, a closing survey. So we ask you to stay engaged if you can and participate in all of those pieces. Please use the chat box or the question box to send in questions, and I would encourage you to send them in as they come up for you. I'll sift through them, and if they end up getting answered over the course of the session, not to worry, I won't ask it for you. Since you're muted, my job is to sift through those questions, and when we get to that section of the session, ask the questions that seem the most germane at that point. All right, so next slide, please. So what do we mean by advancing practice? What we're trying to do with advancing practice, next slide, is essentially unstick, to use Ruth McCambridge's language, conversations about management and leadership practice that will increase our organization's impact and contribution to social change. And the concept here, as you see from her writing earlier this year on the left, is that there are certain conversations that we've been circling around for a decade or more in the sector. And I would argue that investing in our own leadership development, the topic we're talking about today, is one of those conversations where we make advances, but we also get stuck in old habits. And so the point of the Advancing Practice series is to help lift up practices that are really working and also learn from people on the ground and from innovative practitioners how they're getting those practices to stick. Sometimes unsticking conversations means unlearning things. Sometimes it means recommitting to things. Sometimes it means learning new adaptations that are even better suited to what we're trying to do. So across the Advancing Practice series, this is the first of what we hope will be many of these sessions. We're trying to do that. We're also very intentionally trying to curate and lift up the voices of diverse and innovative practitioners and bring them to your desk or office. We want all of our sessions to focus on theory and tether to the larger discourse, but also to really include practical application. And you'll see that there are case examples that we're going to discuss today. And also important, I think, and this is connected to unsticking conversations, is that we're willing to challenge all of our dominant narratives about leadership, quote unquote, best practice wherever necessary. If those best practices that we've learned are getting in our way or keeping us stuck, we want to challenge those and bring practitioners who are willing to challenge those. Next slide. So features that you can expect in Advancing Practice sessions. As I said, we'll definitely use polls, both to find out who's in the room, but also to find out in real time together what the current prevalence is of the practices that we're exploring, or the potential, the appetite for uptake, so that we're all learning that and sharing that data together over the course of a session. As I mentioned, you also take a survey right as the Advancing Practice session closes, so that you can reflect on which of any of the practices feel most germane for your work, and also give us feedback so that we can continue to improve. And then something we're trying to do, again, to focus on unsticking conversations, is to work with those of you who are really trying to adapt these practices. And you'll have a chance in that survey to let us know that you'd like to be part of a 3-month follow-up survey. And we'll ask you what you're learning about implementation or adjustment of the practices. And when you provide us that information, it will inform future sessions. but it will also help us inform the content we bring to you across the Nonprofit Quarterly platform, whether it's other online events, articles, etc. So that's a little bit about what we're doing and what I'm trying to do with my colleagues at Nonprofit Quarterly in curating these sessions. Next slide. All right, about today's topic. Next slide. Today we're joining a conversation that's been going on for at least a decade, if not more, in the nonprofit sector about leadership coaching. And we called today's session Beyond Executive Coaching, not because executive coaching isn't wonderful and essential, but because oftentimes it's been a bit rarefied and contained to either executives or quote unquote C-suite positions. And what we're excited about today is exploring how coaching methods and another methodology called action learning that's related to it can actually be focused on middle managers, for lack of a better term, emerging leaders, if you will, next generation leaders, not just for their own development, interestingly enough, but also so that they can participate before they move on in accelerating organizational change. And I just want to call your attention, if you need to reground in what the conversation is about coaching right now or where it is, always can search the Nonprofit Quarterly website, just enter coaching in the search box. A couple of things to note. Way back in 2008, we have a guide called A Leader's Guide to Executive Coaching that is still, it ages very well and reviews sort of what coaching is, when to use it, when not to use it, and attempts to look at the return on investment, which is something that you'll see in a lot of the literature, both in the for-profit and nonprofit sector. Is this method, does it work? And quote unquote, what's the ROI or return on investment? Frankly, it's not a question that I worry about too much, having been around coaching for a long time, but I know that when we think about efficacy, we also think about cost and the opportunity cost of investing in any kind of a methodology. By 2013, if you review the interview with Bill Ryan that Ruth McCambridge did, he was evaluating a leadership program put on by the Haas Jr. Fund, which is still in existence, called the Flexible Leadership Award. And he too was really concerned with, or not concerned with, but noting how concerned the field was with different definitions. Is it coaching? Is it consulting? Is it therapy even? Does it have therapeutic elements or psychological elements that we want to be aware of? So lots of talk about definition. And he too talked about ROI and how people can consider that. One of the things I want to lift up about that piece that I think will be brought through this session is that he noticed in the leaders, the coaches, and the coachees, three different things going on. Some people were talking about coaching as a profession, that is a certified coach, a discipline that is to be learned and mastered and then offered as a professional capacity. Some people were incorporating coaching into their existing practice as a coach or as a consultant or a facilitator or a teacher. And I think we'll hear some of that today. Some people are certified coaches, some people may not be, but they're bringing coaching practice to their work in an integrative way. So there was professional, there was practice or integrated practice that Ryan lifted up in that research. And then thirdly, perspective. Some people were bringing a coaching perspective to many of their interactions, interpersonal, at work, in supervisors. So it became more of a perspective, a way of looking at how to do the work. So also something to look back at. And then most recently, just recently, some of our CRE folks produced a piece in the quarterly called Self-Coaching Strategies for Nonprofit Leaders, which really builds on that too and says that we can actually apply coaching methodology to ourselves. So you can reground on the website. Next slide. And then just a very quick scan of the recent quote unquote scholarly research that I found interesting. On the left, you're going to see a quote from a recent study about the enormous growth of professional coaching. According to the International Coach Federation, a total of 2,100 professional coaches were operating globally in 1999. By 2012, there were 47,500, $700 million in revenue. So enormous growth, and that's just through the lens of one of the certifying agencies. And now we're 6 years later, and I can say from my own experience in just watching how many folks are adding coaching to their professional toolbox, that number is probably, could easily have doubled. So we're talking about a field, the professional field, that has grown enormously. So interesting study there. That study also found, it was comparing, if you can see in that tiny little writing, efficacy of individual coaching, self-coaching, and group training. And it found very clearly that individual coaching was the most successful intervention for coachees meeting their goals. Interesting. And on the right is a retrospective study of over 3,800 coaching pairs. And the interesting takeaway there, and this is just from 2 years ago, from a global study, the interesting takeaway there is that the efficacy of coaching as assessed by the coachee had the most to do with the alliance that's formed, the methodology and goal focus that's formed between the coach and the coachee, and very little to do, if anything, to do with personality matching. And even the self-efficacy of the coachee was somewhat mitigated by the strength of that alliance and the focus on goals and follow through. So there's a lot of good research about how coaching works and why it works. The only thing I want to mention here about it not being about personality is that it very well may be about identity though. And I know when I was at Compass Point, we had a lot of success and a lot of evidence about matching coaches of color, LGBTQ folks with coaches and people with lived experience of how those dynamics work, especially in the nonprofit sector. So while it's not necessarily about matching personalities, there may be reason to consider identity and lived experience in bringing coaches into your organization and matching them. Next slide. Okay, so we are going to move into today's session with that grounding and the practice shifts. We're calling this advancing practice. So the practice shifts that we're going to explore today are making strategic developmental investments in middle manager leaders across an organization through coaching methodologies. So we're distinguishing here between strong supervision, which is certainly important. I know Pavitra will talk about different ways of developing middle managers, but we're specifically talking in the bulk of this about focusing that middle strata, if you will, with coaching and investing in their development. The second shift we're talking about is thinking about coaching as having application not just in individual development, but in group development and even organizational development objectives explicitly. And the third piece is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it or are new to it, looking at how building on coaching, the methodology of action learning can support an organization, including middle managers, in building their own capacity without outside support all the time to frame issues and work collectively to solve problems. So those are the shifts that we're going to explore through Katie and Pavitra's work. Next slide. So let me introduce our guest faculty from CRE. Next slide. Katie Leonberger is President and CEO of Community Resource Exchange, or CRE, and Pavitra Menon is Director of Leadership Development. You saw their relevant and impressive bios when you signed up for this course, so I won't speak to that as much now, but just to remind you, if you don't know, that Community Resource Exchange, or CRE, is based in New York City, though I know that their work and certainly their field building work pulls them outside of the city. And they do consulting and leadership development with a focus on addressing poverty, equity, and increasing opportunity for everyone through the groups that they work with. So welcome to both of you. And I'm going to turn it over to Katie to get us started.
Thank you, Jean, and good afternoon or good morning to everybody, depending on where you are. We are thrilled to get to be here today and be part of the very first Advancing Practice session. So as Jean mentioned, today we'll talk through a couple different approaches to coaching and really focus on that mid-level manager, emerging leader strata. And we'll talk through what we mean by those different types of coaching, the different types of impact that we can have with them. We'll share a couple of case examples, and we'll importantly highlight what worked and what didn't. And then from that, we'll pull out some learnings we have around consideration for implementation. And as Jean mentioned, this pulls from some of the work that we've been doing at CRE over the past couple of years. And that was spurred very much in part by our desire to support leadership development at multiple levels within an organization, as we were seeing that for our now almost 40 years of doing this work with nonprofits of all shapes and sizes, many were feeling a need and had a real need to really develop multiple levels of talent within their organization. And frankly, also because we ourselves are a capacity builder, we have an organizational development lens to all of the work that we do. And so we're often thinking about how do we make sure that anything we're doing is actually benefiting the entire organization that we're working with in some way. And so while we've been doing this work for a while, we don't consider ourselves experts on this. I want to just say very explicitly that we believe we're still learning. So we're excited to share what we've learned to date and hopefully hear through the Q&A a little bit about what other people are doing, understand other needs and opportunities that you all are seeing, and really hopefully see this as continuing the conversation that has been going on about coaching and maybe taking it to a slightly different place and figure out where we might go from here for greater impact, both for the organizations that we're all working with or are a part of, and the larger sector.
Hey, Katie.
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. In my excitement / nervousness about framing my first webinar, I forgot to find out who's in the room for you, and I know that we want to do that before we get into the content. Would you mind if I interrupted and did that?
Please do. Perfect timing.
Okay, great. So we're going to use our first poll to find out who all is in the room. And if you can let us know what your primary professional identification is in attending this webinar. All right. Great. We have a mix of nonprofit executives. It's wonderful to see so many nonprofit staff who aren't executives, who are also interested in middle manager leadership development, and a number of coaches, consultants, trainers as well, which is great to advance practice in that regard. Thank you for sharing that. All right, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, and thank you, Jean. And it's very helpful to know who's here. So we hope that we will be able to speak to all the different needs and interests of those who are participating. So with that, we'll kick it off into the content and start by defining our terms. So I'll ask the next slide. And we can go on to the next one too. Thanks. Great. So at CRE, we think of leadership coaching along a continuum, really ranging from traditional one-to-one coaching with executive leaders, as Jean was touching on a few moments ago, all the way through to peer coaching. And so you see on this slide just brief listings and definitions of those types of coaching. So if you start at the top on the right-hand side, individual coaching with executive leaders, which I think is likely, I'm guessing, what most are familiar with. This is one-to-one coaching to help an individual executive, often in the C-suite, to strengthen their leadership or management skills, perhaps to help them lead or manage through a particular change or challenge that they're trying to work through within the organization, and perhaps also to enhance team effectiveness for their senior team or the organization as a whole. Then the other type of coaching we think about at the individual level is kind of everything else, right? So with non-executive leaders. And for us, that can take a couple of different forms, or perhaps better said, we work with a couple of different groups to do that. What we'll talk about most today is our work with middle managers. So these are kind of mid-level managers, high-performing, likely to move on to a senior level role at some point. But I also should note that we're seeing really promising results working with what we call first-time supervisors. So folks who maybe were actually on the front lines of delivering service for their nonprofits, and then because they're doing well, get promoted to that manager level, but maybe never had any training in how to be a manager. And so outside of thinking about training for them, is there coaching that they could be offered as well? The third type of coaching to consider is team coaching, and this is the idea here of one coach to work with multiple members of a team, really with the goal of strengthening the team or helping the team achieve a goal around how it functions in some way. So that might look like team effectiveness work or team building work for some organizations. And then peer coaching is the other type of coaching that we'll spend a fair amount of time on today. And we put here kind of that is defined as many to many. And the idea here is that it's the peers in a group of multiple colleagues or peers who are coaching each other. And then in this case, the external coach, if it was someone from CRE, it would be one of our team members, would facilitate that peer conversation to make sure that everyone is getting the benefit of their peers' knowledge, questions, and ideas. So there's a particular methodology that we use called action learning, and we'll speak through that in a couple of minutes. And I think regardless of which type of these approaches to coaching one might be using, one of the things that we like to highlight is it being critical to think through what are the needs and goals of the organization, beyond just even the needs of the individual who might come interested in coaching, in order to figure out which of these approaches might make the most sense for an organization, because we often see that you can actually get huge organizational benefits as well as the individual benefit by doing more than just individual coaching of executives. And the other thing that I would add here that we think about as a kind of hybrid or different type of coaching is what we call integrated coaching at CRE. And that's because we do a whole lot of consulting work at CRE as a capacity builder. And so we often are finding ourselves integrating that coaching approach that Jean talked about into the consulting work that we do. So for example, if we were doing a strategic plan with an organization and the executive leader is either new or perhaps they really want to lead some type of change management initiative at the organization, there's often coaching that we're doing part and parcel and throughout the process of the actual coaching work to create that strategic plan or whatever the consulting deliverable might be. And we think it's important to mention that because what we see is that integrated coaching can have a really direct impact on org effectiveness and organizational improvement, even when a group isn't necessarily signing up directly for coaching. And so with that, I will hand it over to Pavitra to give a quick overview of how these different approaches work at CRE, and I'll just flag that we'll focus primarily today on the second, the individual coaching with non-exec leaders, and then the fourth around peer coaching or the action learning methodology. So next slide, please.
Thanks, Katie, and hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all today. I guess I'll start with just, sort of taking off on where Katie left off with what happens in a coaching relationship, whether it be integrated coaching, whether it be a standalone executive coaching work plan, or it be action learning, peer coaching, team coaching, whatever. We believe that coaching is an inquiry-based cycle, and by that we mean we strive for the coachee or the participants to really trigger curiosity. We're looking to get underneath what the presenting issue might be by asking the right kind of questions and really not coming into the relationship with any kind of preconceived solutions, but helping the participant or the coachee themselves come up with creative ideas and ways to solve the problems that they may be bringing to our coaching relationship. At CRE, our coaching is often grounded in some kind of data collection or data assessment, whether it be through an assessment tool like a 360 or just gathering the right kind of information from the coachee and or their supervisors or their managers. And this data actually serves as the trigger for self-reflection and sets the context for the coachee to be able to set their own goals for what they want to accomplish in the coaching relationship. Ultimately, it's about the coachee having the confidence and feeling empowered to take action. We know that as adults, we learn by doing oftentimes, and so whether we're talking about doing this in the peer coaching sense of action learning, or we're doing this in consulting, or we're doing this in a one-on-one coaching relationship, it is in the cycle of feeling empowered to take action, then taking action, and then having the time and space to reflect on the action that was taken, to look back into what worked, what didn't, debrief with folks, particularly when behavior change is involved, to see what worked and what didn't for other people, and then continue in that empowerment, action, reflection cycle. So can I go to the next slide, please? So,
before you move on, Pavitra, we've got a poll just to find out, before we get into the specifics of action learning, how prevalent amongst our participants is our coaching methods generally. So the question is, do you personally employ coaching methods or stances, i.e. that inquiry cycle, in your work currently? No, at times, but not consistently, or yes, it's core to your approach of working with others? Great, so we have quite a few people that are using coaching methods or are familiar with them to some extent, and quite a few that are, it's central to their toolbox. So that's great, it gives us a sense of who's in the room. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Jean. So just transitioning really quickly to where we see, sort of the peer coaching methodology be most effective with going out, right, where you can get more bang for your buck with multiple folks in the room getting coached at the same time, though not in an individual setting. We use a methodology called action learning. And there are two kinds. There's the single program action learning, multiple program action learning. Basically what action learning is the use of peer coaching and appreciative inquiry, where participants literally learn by acting on issues that are significant to them in order to actually make some kind of change. And the change inevitably leads to some improvement in their individual performance or in the performance of their team or department and the organization overall. So it's literally learning by doing and taking action, and then following that cycle that I just walked you all through in terms of the empowerment action reflection. Individual coaching and action learning share a few things in common. Both give participants the opportunity to think about issues and problems in a different light through the use of appreciative inquiry and the art of asking powerful questions, right? The way you ask questions so that it doesn't evoke defensiveness, but rather evokes curiosity. It also, both methodologies, coaching and action learning, use feedback to develop application strategies to address the issues that participants are coming up with. And then in both, it's really, really successful when there is opportunity to try out and or experiment in real time on the job improvements in practices, behaviors, systems, processes, whatever it is that whatever challenge the participant is bringing into the space. With the single program and multiple program action learning, the difference is action learning is a group-based approach to coaching, to peer coaching. And so in the single program action learning, that is focused very much on a single problem or a set of tasks that exists in an organization that needs resolution, and everybody around the table is working on that single problem. In the multiple program action learning, the focus is on individual challenges that every participant brings, and the challenge can range from everything to behavior-related stuff, to creating a new system, to managing up, to whatever. So the challenges are very, very different. And in our experience, we have most often in our leadership programs use the multiple program action learning sort of version of this, where folks are bringing a variety of issues to the table for discussion. So in general, who participates? It would be good to know who participates in these kind of action learning teams. We like the team composition is clearly really important. You want to have folks in the team that have something in common by virtue of being in roles that are either kind of similar to one another, that have similar levels of complexity in terms of what the role is trying to get at within a particular organization. And you want to make sure that the participation is such that everybody can participate equitably. And so let's say we're doing action learning within a single institution where everybody works for the same organization. We want to make sure that power dynamics and things like that are taken into consideration, and that supervisors and supervisees are not in the same action learning team. Action learning starts with a group of really high potential individuals with diverse functional backgrounds and experiences. And this cross-functional team brings important and urgent work challenges that they would like to discuss as and when these teams meet. With the multitude of different perspectives that are brought to the group, each individual that's participating is able to move beyond their own area of expertise, combining the broad knowledge base of others that they can tap into around the table. And then they come up with ideas and solutions that they may have individually not been able to come up on their own or have individually considered before. The duration of action learning varies on a case-by-case basis, but most engagements last anywhere from about 9 months to a year. And when we walk through the cases, we'll give you a little bit more detail on how that exactly pans out. I'd like to turn it over to Katie to basically discuss the impact of coaching before we get to our cases. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Pavi. So on this next slide, you see we've outlined on the right-hand side of the page that there are multiple benefits, almost levels of impact of this type of approach to coaching, be it whether you're coaching multiple mid-level managers within one organization or using some form of action learning within an organization. So you see those three levels shown on the right, and if you start at the bottom, I think that's the one that's likely familiar most to everybody in thinking about the benefits of coaching, right around the value of helping someone learn how to improve their leadership style, leverage their own leadership style to be more effective, helping them learn how to manage better across their teams or their organizations, whether that's around managing difference and conflict or balancing the roles of leader and manager. And then, you know, the third thing we usually add in here is around enhancing team effectiveness, right, and thinking about how do you leverage diversity within your team, how do you increase collaboration and the impacts of that, et cetera. So that I think is probably pretty standard in thinking about the impacts of coaching. And then when you think about that impact at the mid-level manager, middle management strata, there's a couple of different ways that we think about it, but you see here too are, you know, as Pavi was describing, if you're using certain types of action learning that can allow and empower, frankly, mid-level managers to contribute to problem solving within the organization. And I think almost any types of these, as long as there's some commitment from the organization to support those mid-level managers, assuming they continue to perform well, it still help them see a career pathway and a future for themselves at the organization. And then at the org level, right, kind of org-wide, we see a lot of benefits from both of these approaches. One is, again, if you use the action learning approach, this idea that mid-level managers are, if they're in an action learning group, potentially working on real change initiatives for the organization that they can use and put into practice and, frankly, try out and go back and improve as they move through the program to actually see real impact from those initiatives. And then I think the other benefit that goes with either the types of coaching that we're talking about here is that because you are bolstering and, frankly, supporting and helping to develop your mid-level managers, your high potential managers, those who might come on to become leaders later on, you're developing a succession capacity within the organization, which we would hope would benefit that organization for a long time to come. And so for us at CRE, as an OD or organizational development consulting organization ourselves, we tend to approach all types of coaching, even individuals with you know, CEOs or EDs, with that organizational development lens. Yet we also see that benefit to the individual, and we also, that's why a lot of folks come for coaching, right? So we don't forget about that either. And what we see also is, like, you know, that a lot of these different impacts map back to the reasons or the rationale that nonprofits might come and ask for some type of coaching in the first place. And, you know, some of those drivers that we see a lot are things around org growth or expansion. There's a new cohort of managers within an organization. Now that some of the groups we're working with know that we've been working with mid-level managers, they'll come and actually ask for this type of approach with their whole level of mid-level managers. And then, of course, what you see a lot with any type of coaching, I think, is wanting to solve specific problems within the organization, be it a particular org-wide challenge or particular needs around individual professional development. And the one thing I'll flag there, we'll come back to this in a minute, but we sometimes do get folks coming to us and saying they want us to coach so-and-so because there's a performance issue and, you know, there's something to be improved, which in our experience doesn't typically lend to a successful or really worthwhile coaching endeavor. So we try to shy away from those, but then try to figure out what actually could be better impacts for the organization and what might the organization be willing to do to support the individual whom they're maybe coming to us about. And so thinking about that impact, again, beyond the individual and thinking about the middle management and organizational levels, I think one thing to note is that, again, even when coaching just one individual, there's always that potential for larger impact for those two higher levels. And for us, we see that happen in a couple of different ways. One is it could just happen organically, right? Because you happen to be coaching enough mid-level managers who take some initiative and talk amongst themselves and all together and make a major difference for the organization. But there's other things that the organization can do to try to intentionally structure the coaching or the action or learning to enable those benefits to occur at that mid-level strata or for the organization at large. And that can be everything from supervisors checking in with the mid-level managers who are getting coaching to help make sure that they are understanding what the goals are for those mid-level managers to help support them in achieving them, down to actually taking a break to figure out what's everyone talking about, what are the themes that are coming out in those sessions, and then including also investing in follow-on work to really tackle any themes that would come out of individual coaching with multiple middle managers or an action learning approach that kind of naturally will surface some of the themes or challenges that multiple people are seeing. And so, you see that again through the change initiatives, through perspectives of the individual participants being broadened at the middle management level. And then really this enhanced learning for participants that they feel like that they've been invested in, which leads to, from our view, really empowerment and greater commitment to wanting to make a difference for the organization. And so as we think about these different types of impacts, there's a couple considerations just to flag too, and that's what you see listed on the left-hand side of this page. And one is just to note the natural tensions that arise between individual coaching and organizational development. And that occurs a lot for us at CRE, again, because we come in with an organizational perspective, and sometimes we're coaching individual managers or executive leaders. And it might end up being that the right answer for that manager or leader is perhaps to leave the organization, let's say. And for us, that's always a bit of a conundrum, because we are, from an individual impact perspective, happy to see that that person has found the right thing for them and they know what they want to do. From an org perspective, we're always concerned, because then that organization has to deal with the short-term pain of having a lost an employee. You can make the argument over the long term, perhaps it's better because then they get someone else in the role with a better fit. And for the sector at large, assuming the person stays in the sector, there's benefit there too. But that's something that we're balancing a lot, and a lot of it comes down to setting expectations around how to define success of any of these types of coaching at the get-go. And really, I think for us, that leads to the second point, which is we see these particular special impacts that you can get from investing in middle management that goes beyond just making them better supervisors or better at their job. And again, it goes to both the talent pipeline perspective, it goes to the change they can make because they're more empowered, and they feel more committed to the organization. But it's not always a given, right? And so helping people understand about the potential for this, but then what's required to really enable it within an organization is important. And that leads to the third point on the bottom left here around one thing that we think is critical for any type of coaching project is really doing what we call like designing the alliance between those who are involved in the coaching engagement, be it simply between a coachee and the coach, or if that coachee is not at a senior level where they actually have a supervisor, we like to bring the supervisor in to help everyone set expectations around what are the goals for this relationship, what are we trying to get out of it, what are the boundaries to work, what do we think this can and cannot do, and what is the organization prepared to do to help support and reinforce any of the potential benefits that the coaching work might actually provide. And that's important, I think, whether you're doing coaching of mid-level managers, one-to-one, or doing the action learning approach, mainly because action learning often will also bubble up some questions or potential needs for changes with an organization that we think it's critical the organization knows might happen ahead of time, so they're ready to respond. Because as Pavi will walk through in a moment, when groups aren't ready to respond, you lose the benefit of that intervention altogether. So I think in sum on this page, outside of trying to communicate the three different levels of impact that we see, I think the big takeaway we'd emphasize here is that in general, we see that really pushing coaching at the individual or peer level beyond just the C-suite or the executive suite still benefits that level, and also the interest of the larger organization, while of course empowering and benefiting the individuals getting the direct coaching as well. So there's a lot of reasons we'd argue to think about this. But we're going to talk through two case examples coming up. One is of coaching multiple mid-level managers within a large agency, and the other is of action learning with two different agencies, so we can do a little compare and contrast. And in all of these, I would just say that we've followed a similar process as we would use for any engagement at CRE, which kicks off with some type of intake and needs assessment, where an organization will come to us asking for help. And I should say, particularly in the beginning, we are often the ones suggesting peer coaching based on what we are hearing from about the need and the intended or desired outcomes of a particular engagement. So sometimes we are the ones suggesting this based on what we hear. And then the actual projects themselves will kick off some type of launch. Very importantly, have the goal setting and expectation setting with all who will be involved. And then have that cycle of reflection, empowerment, and action that Pavi talked about, and really for us making sure that that's fueled by information or data in some way. And then the key for us at the end also is to do some type of formal closeout that includes aligning on next steps, which we think is really important for figuring out how do you, for lack of a better way of describing it, almost manage the tail that can come out of these projects to ensure there's real impact that carries on within the organization. So with that very short intro, I will turn it over to Pavitra to talk through the examples. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Katie. So the first example that I'd like to walk you through is to follow on what Katie just described, which was middle-level management coaching for individuals at the mid-manager level at a large city government agency, where multiple mid-level managers engaged in coaching across a variety of different departments. So this particular agency, the leadership of this agency, recognized that it really needed to develop an entire cadre of high potential middle managers who, for a variety of reasons, were suddenly poised to take on more leadership within specific departments as this agency kind of, started to do some new and different things. To date, CRE has coached one-on-one upward of, I believe, 50 managers and still more coming. And this initially started off as a request from a couple of departments that were housed under one senior leader, and has now cascaded through the entire agency. And it's a large city government agency, as I said. In addition, because so many individuals, and as a result of these being middle-level managers, their supervisors, so the individuals and their supervisors were exposed to and impacted by coaching, we began to see requests for other technical assistance and OD initiatives begin to bubble up, and requests for things that related to leadership and professional development, like standalone workshops for entire groups of folks within the department who did not have the opportunity to engage in coaching on things like managing change or managing across different things like that. But we also received requests for additional support for team effectiveness and team coaching, again, involving those that had been coached one-on-one and maybe including some of their direct reports and others who didn't have the opportunity for the one-on-one coaching. I think what worked really well in this agency and they continue to be a good partner to us is that the leadership really recognizes and wants to invest in individual coaching, not for remedial purposes, but recognizing the developmental effects of how this individual coaching really helps these managers be as strong and as effective as they can possibly be in their roles, and in their roles also leading and supporting others. I guess what sometimes didn't work, in particular one-on-one coaching equations, was when that alliance that Katie had mentioned just earlier was maybe not as well designed or was not as clear. And that, there are some external factors that sometimes contribute to that, like supervisor transition, or maybe the supervisor suddenly got promoted to something else. There's a lot of change happening in this agency. Or the coachee had no accountability within the agency to try out anything new that was coming out of coaching. And so in those instances where the coachee and supervisor were not, really in sync for whatever reason, the coach would have had to hit pause and kind of reboot the coaching relationship to make sure that those things, the expectations were aligned, the supervisor was brought in, that the coachee had the kind of support that they really needed in order to be successful. The impact that we saw from one particular organization or agency is, as I said before, coaching opened up additional professional and organizational development opportunities, such as things like, in addition to things like team effectiveness and things like that, there were requests that came through for strategic planning, requests that came through to do activities that would clarify people's roles and goals as it related to long-term vision and strategy, connecting strategy to the organization's overall strategy, departmental strategy to overall strategy. And in one particular instance, it actually led to full-blown department restructuring, and these departments are almost like mini organizations, if you will. So it was a large strategic exercise and a large organizational developmental initiative that really got triggered by one particular coach and coachee equation, kind of opening up what was underneath some of the problems this person was facing that had larger departmental ramifications. In addition, the leadership of the overall agency received a profile of, we did 360s, the basic data assessment tool that we use for every manager in this agency was a 360. And the senior team that originally had come to us with this request has now got a, sort of an agency-wide composite or a picture of their entire middle management leadership and managerial assets and challenges. So it's like a really neat way to see kind of across the board where, they were really doing well in some areas and what areas there were gaps and what they needed to do to fix those. The organizational development impacts from this type of approach are truly significant, but they can't always be seen at the beginning of these relationships. You can't often predict that this is exactly what is going to happen until you get into those relationships and start digging deeper and having those type of conversations and getting more and more people involved. But we do know that coaching will often, if done well, has significantly shown us anyway that the impact definitely doesn't stop at the individual, it cascades over to the organization. Can we move to the next slide, please? All right, so transitioning from there to a couple of examples on that speak to action learning, which is the peer coaching methodology that I had talked about earlier. So here we wanted to showcase kind of two multi-service nonprofit organizations that serve specific neighborhoods here in New York City. And both these organizations engaged in mid-level and senior level managers participating in action learning with CRE. So we had this opportunity because both these organizations actually were part of a larger talent management initiative. That initiative kind of addressed talent management strategy with senior executives or the management teams of these large nonprofits. And one sort of outcome from, or one sort of deliverable from that they had to work on was strengthening their, sort of the next rung of leaders, the emerging leaders. So both these agencies came to us almost around the same time, sort of one after the other, in very short period of time. Wanting us to provide the next level down with some leadership development opportunities, and obviously doing this on with resource constraints and things like that, and the numbers that they were talking in terms of the number of participants that they wanted this opportunity to touch was 45, I believe, in one with the first agency and about 36 in the other. And so we use the action learning or peer coaching modality to achieve some of the outcomes that they wanted in terms of, one, making sure that all participants felt like they were networked, that they, these are large city agencies, these are large nonprofits where sometimes, folks don't even know what's happening on the other side of the institution. And so one real tangible outcome was, we want our mid-level folks to be really more integrated and more connected. We want, we want to be able to offer holistic services, and in order to be able to do that, we need our people connected. So that was one outcome that was sort of that they could see from an organizational perspective. But they also wanted each of these individuals to leave with some strengthened leadership and management capacity. So we decided to embark on action learning. Again, very similar methodology with both groups. The action learning groups themselves were composed to reflect the diversity of thought and opinion, while also ensuring that, supervisors, supervisees were not in the same group, and that different functions were represented sort of in each group, so that people could really achieve that outcome of recognizing what's happening with their colleagues at different parts of the organization. In addition, we, because they were all from the same institution, we were able to gather some intel on, what are the different personality types? Are there folks in these groups, some folks that speak up, others that maybe need to be drawn out a little more, and how can we combine a variety of different personalities in a group to make it interesting? So we did some of that group composition work. Again, similar thing that we did with both groups in terms of setting all of this up. In terms of what the numbers that comprise each of these groups, it was about 6 to 7 managers that met for 3 hours over 10 sessions that spanned 9 to 10 months. The action learning approach that was used was the multiple program action learning approach that I had described earlier, where every participant brought their own leadership or management challenge, and that was up for conversation. And these challenges would range from everything from how to manage an underperforming staff person, how to give difficult feedback, how to have a difficult conversation with a supervisor in a managing up context, how to advocate for personal growth and development when we know we're operating within real resource constraints, how to balance work and life, managing self-care, managing things like staff that have, personal experience or trauma, have experienced trauma, the same kind of trauma that they're dealing with their clients. So in some of these instances, yes, coaching and does take the shape of therapy in some ways, and we have to be really careful on where the boundaries are. What worked well, I think the peer networking piece that both these institutions had aimed for was definitely achieved. The silos that existed were broken down to a great degree. Managers were able to see that they were not alone in their challenges, that they had peers and colleagues within the same institution that faced or were struggling with similar things, and there was a bonding sort of that happened over that. And notably, with one agency in particular, there were significant policy changes as well as programmatic improvements that happened as a result of things that came out of action learning, which was really cool. In one instance, with these two groups, in one instance, the leadership commitment, which I will speak to in the next piece, was not there, and so it didn't work quite as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that if we can go to the next slide. So in both instances, one thing that we know now is that the executive director and that person's executive team needs to really be bought into this process and be willing to be vulnerable to things that these action learning groups will bubble up. And then really demonstrate a commitment to making the changes that people were requesting. Even if it was to say, we can't do it just yet, but it's on our radar and we will address this, and this is how we plan to do it at some other point in time. Even if it was to say just that, actually having the guts to come out and say it. In addition, proactively checking in with the participants, kind of, more formally through check-ins with CRE, but also just informally while walking down the hallways and asking people, how's the action learning group going, what's going on, and learning that way about, sort of staying committed to the process. It does take 9-10 months, and so, staying committed to proactively checking in with the participants. And then really demonstrating that this is not, their burden to fix, but that everybody's in this together. And whatever challenges were coming up, or appreciating that folks were bringing these up and coming up with strategies together with the participants to address some of those challenges. The organization that really benefited from this, where the leaders were truly committed to this process, ended up having 2 big cohorts of action learning managers come through, and then were so gung-ho about it that they decided to train. They asked for volunteers. 6 people volunteered to be trained in the action learning methodology so that they could facilitate their own action learning groups without a CRE or any other facilitator present. And so from our perspective, we saw that as a real win, where the capacity internally was fully built to do this work on their own. In contrast, the other executive and the other leadership team was not as invested in the process. They kind of took a more hands-off approach. They perhaps mistakenly had the, sort of belief that, yes, the problems would be brought up and the solutions would be, brainstormed, and the implementation of those solutions would be the responsibility of the people participating in action learning to figure out. There wasn't much checking in and things like that happened, and quite frankly, the initiative felt like it did fall flat, even though the peer networking piece of it was achieved. So I'd like to turn it back over to Katie to kind of discuss the conditions for success and the factors to consider for successful implementation of any of them.
Great. So we'll share a few thoughts on implementation considerations based on our experience to date, and knowing that this list will hopefully get fleshed out over the months and years to come as well. So we'll turn to the next slide, please. And so we'll start by thinking about what mindsets are necessary for success for this, and Pavitra touched on a couple of them already, but before I even talk through the words on this slide, I think two things I would emphasize in all instances of doing any of these types of coaching. And one is the thing that you've probably heard us harp on now a few times in this discussion, which is the importance of discussing and setting clear expectations up front for everybody who's involved with the coaching in some way. That really shapes how the projects will go, for how we as coaches approach the work and relationships, to how the participants within the organization experience and approach it, to how their supervisors enable it or don't enable it, to how leadership makes real change happen for the organization or not, as Pavitra was saying. And then I think the second piece around kind of mindset writ large is this idea that I think for any type of coaching to be successful, a key mindset there is really an openness to change and a willingness to try out new behaviors. And again, that goes as much for the coachee or the participants in the actual coaching, as well as anybody else in the organization who needs to support, enable, and help make that change possible within the organization beyond even just the individual level. And so you see a little bit of that show up now on these words on the page, but if you think about a couple of the mindsets that we've touched on, just to be more explicit about them, I think a big thing for us is that this is not traditional HR performance management. It is really a way of thinking about how to have multiple levels of impact within an organization, some of which are an individual performance, but a lot of which, and sometimes the most powerful, are more broad than that. And that also, as you think about, I think actually true for all levels, but starting at the individual level, this isn't remedial, right? This is only going to work when it's approached as a developmental opportunity for the individuals involved, and I would argue also for the organization as a development opportunity and growth opportunity. And so that gets us to a point beyond here, which is a fear that I think a lot of organizations have, and understandably so, right? Like, what happens if these managers leave after we've invested in them, and wasn't that a waste of money? And I think it's a kind of almost knowing that, going in with your eyes wide open, that yes, some people might leave and other folks might get really excited, empowered, and double down on their commitment to the organization. And so that if you are worried about somebody leaving, that might not be the right reason then to go into this type of supportive coaching of any kind. And then I think similarly, to make this coaching successful, be it multiple mid-level managers getting coached individually or more of an action learning peer approach, is that, as you've heard us say, right, this kind of coaching needs to be tied to the organization's larger goals and strategies. And to that end, as the folks who are in decision-making roles with positions of authority, are those people ready to hear what mid-level managers might share back? And are they willing to see them as opportunities for organizational development versus just mid-level managers getting together and finding problems with the organization, which frankly is we think is a very cool opportunity for any organization to get the benefit of that feedback from their team members, and that they've created the conditions for their team members to give them that feedback in a way that feels safe enough for it to come out. I think the other thing on mindsets that we would just slide on this page is that related to making sure that everyone's entering into any of these engagements with the right type of expectation and mindset, is making sure that everyone understands what their role is within the larger coaching engagement or relationship. So that means for those participating, or the coachees, as we would call them. Do they understand it's their responsibility to make time for this, to show up, to participate, and really importantly, to be vulnerable and practice and apply what they're learning, and maybe even know that they might make mistakes and then learn from that. And that's, I think, an easier mindset to get into when you're doing individual coaching, but when you're in a peer learning context, that can be a little intimidating, right? So making sure that that's a part of the expectation and folks know what they're walking into. Similarly, for executives, we talked a bit about already kind of their role in being champions of this, of sponsoring and reinforcing some of the work that would come out of this, and that helping those leaders understand what their role is in making this either fly or maybe not fly so high. And then for any supervisors, right, if it's mid-level manager, individual coaching, what can they do to partner and support with their direct reports to help them be successful, and really, I think, putting into practice over the long term what that coachee might have benefited from for a shorter term coaching engagement. So with those mindsets, we'll go to the next page, please, to talk about what might be needed for investment. So there's lots of different resources to be thinking about outside of just mindset shifts. And the one thing that we want to highlight is, it's more than just the cost of coaching. And so any organization looking to take this on should be aware that it's more than just the cost of the coaching and the coachee's time to be in those meetings. And so we've laid out here a couple of different types of resources we'd encourage folks to think about. The first is probably the most obvious one, just the money, right, to contract with someone who's going to provide that type of facilitation or coaching support. And then time is another big one, and I think it's, again, not just the obvious of the time spent in coaching sessions, be they peer coaching or individual sessions, but really that if you want to carry this forward as an organization, the time it takes for folks to learn the methodologies, to practice using them and employing them on the job going forward and outside of the actual sessions, and frankly, to have the space, both as an individual who's learning and growing from some type of coaching, as well as at that mid-level management strata writ large, or the organization overall, for folks to really digest and process what's coming out of those sessions, and then be able to act on the results in a very intentional way to drive those larger levels of change beyond the individual. There's another piece around restructuring roles, and potentially restructuring roles, I should say, and really how do we make sure that jobs are structured so that this type of investment is valued and not seen as extra or something else you're supposed to add on top of everything else that you do, really helping folks see the benefit of some of this, and then really explicitly making sure that people understand that they'll be recognized and rewarded for supporting these types of practices, so that it's not just something that happens with a coach once a month or every other week or however often that's happening, but that it becomes an ongoing way of doing work within the organization. So that's thinking about the various internal roles as well that are needed to enable that. So we've talked a bit about supervisors and the coachees as well as the coaches. But then even we talk about sometimes at CRA coaches to coaches, right? Who is helping those coaches if they're going to become coaches internally at the organization, like Pavitra was saying with that case example where that organization actually trains some of its own staff on how to do action learning. Who's helping those folks do their job well and learn how to process and support the individuals that they're coaching internally? Subject matter experts who can bring in particular knowledge, particularly if needed, to help solve or unstick a problem that a group might be working on using one of these approaches. And then mentors, again, to help play that safe role that a coach might not necessarily be playing, or a supervisor might not necessarily be playing, but to think about helping the individuals as they move forward in their careers within the organization. And the last point on this slide, I think we also just want to emphasize is, for these investments for an organization to really, we think, have lasting impact beyond even just like the individual impact of whatever change initiatives might happen as a result of the coaching project, it's thinking about what can the organization do to reinforce and support some of these changes and, frankly, support some of these behaviors so that they continue throughout the organization going forward. And that can be everything to thinking about how do you incorporate things into performance reviews if it has to do with a particular way of thinking about incorporating coaching into supervision, down to if there are going to be major change initiatives, who's responsible for making those happen and being held accountable for making those happen after the action learning work is done. And so when we think about all of these, I think we just sum it up by saying that while it's important to think through the actual dollar costs, which are very important, we know, particularly in resource-constrained environments, it's also important to think about the value that can come of doing this, and frankly, the opportunity cost of not doing it. And we think that regardless of size of the organization or even issue area of the organization, there's enormous potential in both the approaches that we've talked through today to really help enable change at multiple levels within the organization, provided that the leadership and all those who need to be involved are ready with those mindsets to invest in them. So with that, we will, I think, do a poll before we do Q&A.
Yeah, we'll take a quick poll just to see what's resonating among these practices, and then we've got a bunch of great questions to tackle in our last few minutes together. All right, close that poll, share the results. So it's interest across a lot of them, with the most interest in this applying action learning with middle managers' perspective and the connection there to organizational development as well, which is great. All right, so let's move on to Q&A, and probably not surprisingly to either of you, a lot of the questions are around boundaries and confidentiality, and how to set up that alliance so that a supervisor and supervisee are comfortable. We only have about 6 minutes left in the session. I'd like to get to about 3 questions. So if you could just address some of your advice to either coaches or coaches and or other practitioners around setting those boundaries.
Yeah, so again, if this is a one-to-one coaching situation, then the boundary conversation needs to happen very much right up front, even when kind of figuring out with whoever the sponsor of this coaching is. So let's say it's a middle manager who is being sent for coaching, and their sponsor is the executive director or their supervisor, then that person needs to understand really, really clearly sort of where the boundaries and confidentiality of all of this begins and ends. It's part of what we would do in designing the alliance between the coachee, and their supervisor. It's certainly, you know, we will say things like, on our end, we want to be really, really clear who our client is in that particular instance. Is it the supervisor? Is it the coachee? Is it the organization? And if the answer to that question is it's the supervisor or the organization, and there's the intervention is one-to-one coaching, then we know that there's a disconnect, because our client as coaches always has to be the coachee. And so working through those kinks right up front so that the expectations are clearly set and aligned before anybody embarks on any kind of coaching journey is really key. With peer coaching and action learning, we will always do ground rules and sort of some boundary setting in the room, so that what's said in the room stays in the room, what's learned in the room leaves the room, kind of thing. So oftentimes, particularly when in action learning with peers from the same organization, there is that level of fear, and we have to do some trust building activities and exercises early on in the action learning series to make sure that people around the table are, one, comfortable with us as the outside third party facilitator, but also, and probably more importantly, comfortable with each other and who's in the room. I will say that in years past, we have had, on occasion, people come, you know, kind of tap us on the shoulder outside of a session and say, hey, I really don't feel comfortable being in this room with X individual because there's been some kind of an issue. And we'll work through that on a case-by-case basis. In only one instance do I recall having actually, you know, kind of reconfigured the group based on something like that came up. But I think if we do our work really well on composing the groups in a way that we have taken into consideration all the possible intel that we can get before even embarking on this, that some of these things get resolved, and that the boundaries and the confidentiality agreements and all of that are set and upheld within the group itself.
Thank you, but there is a lot of work into that designing alliance, even at the individual level when it's explicit inside an organizational context, and certainly within the action learning space. And then very briefly, also questions about executive readiness. In your 2 case examples around action learning, one was more successful because of the executive's readiness. And sometimes it sounds like, since most people don't call up asking for action learning, it may be difficult to assess readiness because they didn't even identify that initially as what they were looking for. So very briefly, what are some signs of non-executive readiness where maybe action learning is too ambitious for the culture?
Yeah.
Katie, do you want to try that? Or Pavitra, whoever.
I can go. Looking back at both those examples, I think there were some red flags or warning signs that we could have picked up on right at the beginning when we were sitting with the executive team and the executive director was punting every question to his director of HR and finance. And then that person was punting it over to the director of programs, and it was clear that they were struggling as a team to find accountability and ownership for this. I think even though we kind of tried to name that upfront and got assurances that they would be more connected and sort of plugged in, it's a lot of work when they're not authentically there to keep reminding and sort of flagging and things like that. And one of the things that I think was moderately successful at some point when we recognized that they really weren't, showing up, was that we had internally the action learning facilitators culled together a list of different sort of challenges, organized them by topic and by severity of impact on the organization, and actually took a pause in between and fed it back to the leadership. At which time other environmental factors and things came through. We recognized that this leader was actually transitioning, moving on. There were other things going on. So all to say that, best laid plans, right? Like, I mean, you have to be flexible, you have to be nimble, you have to be able to pull out the plug when you actually feel like this is not going anywhere, and that the sessions are becoming more venting sessions than actually action-taking sessions, and that there is no response, and the action learning groups are actually creating more angst than being of support. And try and this is where I think having our OD lens into this type of work is really helpful, because we then move into, okay, how can we do some integrated coaching with that leadership team to get them to see that this is not working, and that they need to really step it up.
Thank you very much. Thank you both so much for joining us today and serving as guest faculty and focusing our attention on methods for engaging middle managers in strategic leader development. Next slide. So our next steps, next slide, are, as I mentioned at the beginning, you're going to get a survey just as soon as we close this session in a few seconds, and we really appreciate your engagement with that survey, both to give us feedback, but also to let us know if some of these practices are things you're going to focus on in your own work, and so that we can follow up with you in that regard. Next slide. Thank you everybody so much for joining us. Thank you again, Katie and Pavitra. Thank you Fundraise for sponsoring today's session, and thank you all for participating in the polls and for the survey that you're about to take right now. We'll see you at our next session.
Thank you. Bye.